The information contained in this video is strictly for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or other professional advice and is not a substitute for consultation with a qualified professional. The opinions expressed in the show do not necessarily reflect the views of the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development, Borough of Manhattan Community College, and the City University of New York. State of Mind is a web-based discussion program that explores the relevant social, economic, and political issues that are prominent at the post-secondary level of education. State of Mind is sponsored by the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. BMCC. Start here, go anywhere. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Continuing on our Crisis on Campus series, today's topic is about mental health and school shootings. Back with us to help us better understand our topic and provide their unique perspectives are the following guests. To my immediate left is Dr. Tina Walsh, who currently serves as the medical director at South Oaks Hospital, part of the North Shore Long Island Jewish Health System. She's also the director of perinatal psychiatry services at South Oaks Hospital and serves on the steering committee for Katz Women's Hospital at Long Island Jewish Medical Center. Dr. Walsh received her BA from Williams College, her MPH from Yale University, and her MD from Michigan State University. To Dr. Walsh's immediate left is Vice President Scott Anderson, who has served as BMCC's Vice President of Administration and Planning since 2000. He has more than 40 years of professional experience in higher education administration in CUNY at the campus and university levels. VP Anderson received his associate's degree from Queensborough Community College, Certificate of Study from Ruskin College, baccalaureate degree from Queens College, and master's degree from Baruch College. And to VP Anderson's immediate left is Deputy Commissioner Charles DeRienzo. He was the president of SecureCon LLC, a consulting firm that provides assistance in training, management, and security issues based on his extensive 42 years of experience in law enforcement. Prior to SecureCon, he began his law enforcement career with the NYPD in 1965 as a police officer and retired in 2008 as a deputy commissioner. Mr. DeRienzo graduated from the New York Institute of Technology and attended the Columbia University Graduate School of Business and the NYC Police Management Institute. Dr. Walsh, VP Anderson, Commissioner DeRienzo, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
I'd like to start off with an excerpt I was able to find that kind of summed up what we went through for the last several months to really understand how big of an issue mental health and school shootings are. In the past several months, we have seen several incidents of school shootings on college and high school campuses across the nation. UC Santa Barbara, Seattle Pacific University, and Reynolds High School are just three of the most recent academic institutions where a student with mental illness took the lives of faculty and students with the use of a firearm. With that said, since 2010, in the U.S. alone, there have been 95 school shootings with over 100 students killed and another 100 students injured. In the majority of cases, the attacker suffered from some form of mental illness and had easy accessibility to firearms. Commissioner DeRienzo, I'd like to start with you. NRA Executive Vice President Wayne LaPierre stated after the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, that the, and I quote, only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, end quote. He's specifically referring to having armed security personnel at schools. From an enforcement standpoint, what are your thoughts on this proposal?
Well, they're complex issues, and if we go way back to the educational system, we didn't have any security officers in schools, and as things change, we started having unarmed security officers in schools. On college campuses, the colleges hired security officers. In New York State, they're peace officers, some armed, some unarmed. So it's something that the world is changing, and security is changing with it. At your local businesses, you'll in offices throughout the city, you have security desks, you have screening before people come in. So it is an issue that needs to be looked at very carefully. The issue of having an armed security guard. If you wanted that, it's a costly issue. Mm-hmm. But then what are your alternatives in securing your buildings?
So here's a question. Does it act as a deterrent?
Well, you find that in original responses to shootings in schools and shootings elsewhere, the police would wait and mobilize prior to going in. Now the tactics are changing to where the police will immediately go in to confront the shooter, because it appears to be, in many instances, when the shooter is confronted with an armed person, they will either surrender or commit suicide. So there may be some validity in having the law enforcement community coming in there. Whether the schools need to do this themselves, that's very questionable. The schools are dealing very well with unarmed security people, and in New York City especially, with the availability and the response time of NYPD, it almost negates needing somebody armed in there. Most schools now have screening processes coming in where only students are allowed in with turnstiles, ID cards, and the like. So it provides a level of security. In BMCC, they have been very proactive in training their peace officers in dealing with emotionally disturbed people and in active shooter circumstances, how to deal with that. I was very privileged recently to hear Commissioner Bratton speak on this issue. And in New York City schools, the security officers are unarmed. And he is putting all of them through training in dealing with active shooter situations. I go back to my own days in precinct command in the Bronx in the 1990s, and we didn't have the unarmed security officers. I had in Stevenson High School in the Bronx one armed police officer, and he was there in the school whenever the school was open and dealing with all of those problems. Dealt with them very well. But again, life changes. After 9/11, the whole world is changing. You have the Mumbai attack, which is not in a school, but it is an attack in a shopping mall. These are issues that we are trying to deal with in society. So
let's take that conversation to the academic level. Vice President Anderson, predicting a school shooting is a bit like predicting where lightning is going to strike the ground. It's virtually impossible. There are some generic indicators, but outside of that, it is really hard to be proactive. Commissioner DeRienzo alluded to actions and preparation that the BMCC is taking. Can you speak to the BMCC, and can you speak to academia as a whole as to how do you become more proactive versus reactive?
I think the commissioner has actually laid out pretty much a prescriptive blueprint that most of us in higher ed have been following. I think that historically colleges and university campuses have been open architecturally and operationally. They've been open environments. You can't afford to do that anymore. So at BMCC in particular, we've installed turnstiles. So card access, and that's becoming more and more prevalent. And even in the residential halls now, they're becoming very, very cognizant of turnstiles and using optical scanners, et cetera. You have to start closing down all of the ingress and egress points for a perpetrator. And that was the sad, story up in Connecticut. The guy actually knew what the controls were, and he thwarted them. But I think that the other thing that has to be done is that you have to have a staff, whether they're armed or not. We're not armed. We're far more worried about an errant shot going off and hitting an innocent student or a faculty or staff member because of excitement, poor training, panic, whatever. The response rate, and I think the commissioner is absolutely right, the response rate in New York is about 3 to 4 minutes for a PD. So what we try to do is to make sure that our public safety staff are trained to quickly evacuate or force our community into shelter-in-place positions around the campus. Remove the students and the faculty from the danger. Because once that call is made, PD comes in, it's all over. The sad part about these hostage and violent shooters situations are that, unfortunately, the shooter doesn't want to be taken alive. So that invites a different kind of response
Right.
and a different kind of responsibility on the part of campus.
So Dr. Walsh, I want to make sure we're being fair. And if you can take a second to educate our audience, I'm coming into this topic talking about mental health, talking about school shootings. Is the correlation that as strong as we think it is, or is this a misconception by the media?
Well, what people should understand is that although the vast majority of these type of school shootings are done by people who are mentally ill, and I think anyone would say whoever would do that is crazy. I mean, lay people think that immediately. And yes, these people may have a range of different diagnoses and may have psychiatric disturbances for the most part. But people should also understand that the vast, vast majority of people who have mental illness are not violent, but rather are more likely to be the victims of violence themselves. So you have a small group of people from a larger group of people, and unfortunately the media tends to brandish a wide swath of mental illness and think that everyone who's in treatment may suddenly come out with a shotgun and blow away people, and that's simply not the case. Although those perpetrators have been shown to have various disorders, not all the same disorder, from schizophrenia, Asperger's disorder, to personality disorders more akin to things you would see in the jail systems with antisocial personality disorders.
Okay. So going back to Wayne LaPierre from the NRA, he also stated his support for the following measures: increasing funds for a stricter and more efficient mental health system, and reform of civil commitment laws to facilitate institutionalization of the mentally ill when necessary, and secondly, creating a computerized universal mental health registry of those adjudicated to be incompetent to help limit gun sales to the mentally ill. How do patient privacy practices fit into the context of Mr. LaPierre's recommendations?
Well, that's tough, and I think he's reacting, and I understand why he's reacting in such a way, but I don't think that's really the answer that people are looking for. While we do have mental health laws and can involuntarily hospitalize folks, there has to be an imminent risk of danger to self or others, and imminent has to be imminent, not sometime in the future, because there are laws and privacy laws and mental health laws that protect people from being in more of a Soviet system where you are just swept off the streets and stuck in a psychiatric facility without any rights. So there are privacy laws about what a patient and a physician would discuss that protect most of that information, even from family, unless the patient gives explicit permission to discuss it. Now, that is trumped, however, if the patient discloses in a session imminent dangerousness to self or others. We have a duty to warn if a named victim is described by a patient, and we have a duty to involuntarily hospitalize if the patient has what we believe is a threat of imminent self-harm as well. So there's protections about most of the discourse that occurs in a mental health session, but those things are can be thwarted by the content if it is imminently dangerous. Okay. But that's tricky because some of these guys are not seeing a mental health provider.
Yes.
And are just out. These the less dangerous ones are the ones we know about because we can do things. Those that are out in the community who have either a deteriorating mental health state or have never sought treatment and have a psychotic break, or that could be imminent and quick. We don't have a way to control that. Whether or not you're going to regulate weapons for everyone in the world, I mean, that's a whole other political topic. Sure. It depends on your political point of view. And there are very strong opinions, I'm sure, on both sides. But I don't think anyone disagrees that if you could precisely keep weapons from someone who is imminently dangerous, you would want to do that. Right. But it's that razor versus a big hammer that you're trying to swipe it away with. That's the tough call.
So, understanding that the doctor-patient confidentiality cannot be disclosed, what measures, if any, and for you as a board-certified psychiatrist, can one take to better prepare academic institutions in regards to their patients' mental illness, if anything?
Well, personally, I think that good counseling services, letting students know the availability, but these students have to be willing and voluntarily come. Sure. Students are protected by the Disability Act from having to disclose a hidden disability unless it is to their benefit to seek accommodations in an academic situation. So if someone has ADHD and they need extra time for a test, they would probably willingly disclose that so that they could have the academic accommodation. Someone who has a psychotic disorder is under no obligation at this point in time to disclose that. Now, I think anyone who takes any public funding is obliged to follow these federal
That's
state
correct.
laws,
That's absolutely
and
right.
really can't unless the patient chooses to disclose. Now, once a case comes to light in the college, I believe they can require counseling or other things like that, and may require the patient to release some of that information. I have had students who have had an early phase illness at another college, and there was a requirement that I communicate with the counselor prior to authorizing that student to return to school. So it really depends where in the process that student health issue is found.
Right. So I think you might have already answered this question, but this is for both you and VP Anderson. Most colleges do offer free or low-cost mental health services. Are the employees of these services, and ultimately employees of the university, bound by the same rules that apply to doctors?
I don't know. I would think so.
They are all subject to HIPAA.
Right.
Okay.
At a very minimum. If they're college employees, they not only have HIPAA, but they have the Buckley Amendment, which is the FERPA, laws for student information. But HIPAA itself is pretty comprehensive.
There's need-to-know basis, basically, for any
Yeah.
private information, including your social security number
Yep.
or any identifiable
Absolutely.
patient privacy information. But they're bound also as doctors by the same escalation needs should there be an identified imminent threat.
Danger, yeah.
Okay. So if the majority of mental illness, and maybe I'm overreaching here, but occurs after the age of 18, and as such there is no medical history prior to a student enrolling into college, what measures can be instituted to monitor individual behavior deemed dangerous to the student body besides, if you see something, say something?
I really think it's education. I think it's education and availability of mental health resources. And
I think that's absolutely right. But in addition, I think that one of the things that is absolutely critical is that teachers, faculty have enormous capacity to notice behavior going on in the classroom.
Sure.
They're with the students more time than the public safety officer who sees them coming through the door for 15 seconds. I think that we in higher ed have to empower our faculty to recognize behavior that's aberrant, or to really know what's acceptable and what isn't, and then to hook that individual up with the counseling staff to make sure that there is some guidance, some advisement, because not all the individuals with mental health issues are, and you're absolutely right, doctor, they're not registered, and they may not even be in treatment.
Right.
I think it's also the junior advisors or the dorm people, or
the RAs,
the RAs, and
yeah.
the roommates.
Right.
Education about if something's a little strange,
Right.
to escalate that concern to your
Absolutely.
dorm advisors, and then through the channels to make sure that person can access help.
It has to be made clear to everyone that it's okay to report something. If you see something, you say something. It's a spin-off of the same thing.
Right.
If you care about your own health, or you care about the health and safety of the individual,
Sure.
I think colleges have a responsibility to make sure that there's some place that person can go to report that.
We have to move the page a bit. If we saw someone with a severe medical illness, if you had someone who had chest pain
Right.
and their roommates saw that, they would say something.
Right.
This psychiatric disorders are medical disorders
it's an illness,
like
that's all.
any other illness, and
right.
we have to get to the point where it's okay to talk about it. It doesn't ruin the student's life to have that discussed.
Correct.
And just like if they have diabetes and they collapse on the floor in a diabetic coma, somebody's going to say something.
Right.
You have to react. It's a medical illness.
That's a very good way to put it.
But there's still that stigma about it.
Yeah.
I mean, even in law enforcement, we have officers under stress, and they're reticent to go and seek counseling because they think that it's going to affect their career. So we still have to get a step beyond there. We were talking about if you see something, say something. Before it gets to the counselor, if it comes to public safety, oftentimes they could possibly take a look at Facebook regarding this individual, or Twitter, their accounts, to see if there's any additional information that you can glean from those public accounts that would lead you to believe that the person may be in jeopardy, and which would help you in referring those people for additional help.
So I want to take the conversation down a little bit of a different road now. And Commissioner DeRienzo, It is a belief of many that if it were not for the accessibility to firearms, many of the school shootings that have occurred would have been prevented or at the very least curbed in regards to the number of casualties. Aside from changing the laws on Capitol Hill, which we're not here to discuss today, what can law enforcement do, if anything, to prevent those individuals, specifically the acute number with mental health issues, from gaining access to guns?
Well, here in New York City, there are very, very strict gun laws. And it would be very difficult for a person, even a legitimate person, to get a handgun. So, I mean, in that respect here, we're a little ahead of a lot of other places because of our strong laws regarding the registration of guns and the people that will have access to those guns. People that do get guns should have formal training in the safeguarding of the guns, not just for themselves, but for the people around them. It should be very important, should be mandatory that somebody who possesses a gun knows the requirements of safeguarding that gun, that somebody in the family who may have an issue doesn't get a hold of that gun.
So let's take it to a national level. Since its passing in 1993, how effective has the National Instant Criminal Background Check System been? Considering background checks are not required for gun transfers between private parties, is that not a major loophole?
Well, I don't know. Again, these are political issues that are going to have to be dealt with. Here in New York City, we have very, very strict gun laws, whether you're, exchanging, and even in New York State, whether you're exchanging a gun between a relative or not, you must have a license for that gun. You must have, a background check. You must have that gun registered. So throughout New York State, there's very strict laws. But having said that, we have many criminals on the street who never went through these checks. They're getting guns, and if you stop it in one state, or will they come across the borders, So these are issues that need to be dealt with on a national level and confronted. I think the NRA is reacting to the demand to, in their opinion, do away with all guns. And what they're saying, I believe, is that it's more of a personal issue, a mental health issue. But it's a combination of issues. And it would be easy to write a law, regulating guns. That's not the whole issue. There are knives, there are bombs. A person with mental health issues that come to this level are going to hurt people one way or the other. And that's one of the issues that I believe the NRA is addressing. If it's not guns, it may be something else. And we have to have a combination, a full look at the whole issue, mental health and guns and other issues.
Some of the parity laws have helped or are making strides to have mental health be on the same parity or level in benefits for insurance companies, et cetera, as other illnesses, and that's just starting to make inroads. But mental health is traditionally the not sexy part of medicine and is entirely underfunded. And we need to do earlier interventions and assessments for patients, provide more liberal access to mental health care. In the 60s, there was a big move to deinstitutionalize mental health care, and a lot of the state hospitals were shut down. Some for the good, because there were some abuses in some of those areas, but it drastically limited the number of beds for patients who need longer term care. And the hospitals are under tremendous pressure to have short stays and to fight with insurance companies on pretty much a daily basis to get day after day, even for people who have made like the FBI watch list. It's really a battle about money and funding and having adequate funding for treatment.
And the worst of the worst are the only people that are really housed in state mental institutions now. These are people that have committed heinous crimes, and they wind up being housed in the few hospitals that are left. I believe the answer today is you bring somebody in, you evaluate them, you give them the drugs, and you treat them, with the outpatient drugs. The problem is if the people don't take the drugs. New York City police officers respond to hundreds of thousands of calls every year for emotionally disturbed people. And most of these people have been seen and treated and are given medication. But whether they take those medications or not, that's the whole crux of the matter here. And those are the things that need to be dealt with along with the guns.
There are some laws-assisted outpatient treatment programs that help, but again, they're a bit rigid in that you have to have multiple hospitalizations in order to qualify for an AOT team, and there aren't enough of them for the people that need it. We do have medications, long-acting injectable medications that can help with adherence, but patients have to be willing to take that, and there is a reluctance for some patients to do so.
So let's talk about that. And VP Anderson, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I tear my ACL. I disclose that. I go see a doctor. There's no shame there. I have something wrong with me mentally, though. We still live in a society, as open as we are, as much as we talk about things, it's still such a stigma. It's such a stigma to be able to disclose that to an individual, your closest friend, your family members. 18 to 22 years old, this is a very, very unique time in someone's life when they're learning about themselves. How do students, and maybe more importantly, how does the academic world make sure that students feel they can talk openly about these issues, even if they don't necessarily want to disclose them to any authorized figures?
You know, unfortunately, I suspect, and Dr. Walsh, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect that the ability and the readiness of a young person to disclose that, to report that, to feel it's okay to talk about that, is unfortunately influenced by their SES. Because I think certain economic groups are okay about discussing those issues than others, and maybe we can better target, you know, how we can, you know, communicate and educate accordingly. But I think that, for instance, on college campuses, we have very active offices for the challenge, you know, the disabilities offices, and they really do. I think the doctor mentioned that they really do go out of their way to let students know what their rights are, with no, you know, there's no stigma to it. In fact, they're very, they're activist oriented, and students are, you know, they pick up on that. But I think the ability or the readiness to believe that is going to be driven by what educational process they went through before they hit the campus. But I have to tell you that a parent who's lost their child because someone shot them on my campus doesn't give a darn whether that person had a mental disease or not. They want to know, how did you let that happen? What could you have done different to prevent that? And I think from an administrator's point of view, we have to continue working with PD, which we do. We have very close relationships, particularly since we're down at ground zero. We drill our public safety officers. We have scenarios. We give our campus to NYPD and to FDNY so that they can use the campus so that should there be a shooter on campus, the precinct knows exactly what doors to go through first, what entrances to go through. I think the college administration really has a responsibility irrespective of why that person pulled the trigger, irrespective of why they brought a gun on campus, we have to be proactive. And so we have to, you know, figure out how we can prepare our public safety staff and our counseling staff, by the way, because we have nighttime counseling, because we have quite a large evening class load here. We make sure that we have the assistance around the clock. I think I mean, that's how we look at it from a campus perspective.
I think there's two other quick points to make. One is that we have to have in the health classes in elementary school, mental health along with all the other, when the sex talks happen, when everything like that is happening, so kids become accustomed. Culture is changing. We will be able to get away from some of the stigma. Just like heterosexual homosexuality is much more, my kids they're 16 and 20-something, 21, and it's much more accepted than when I was a kid talking about people's sexual orientation. I think we can get there, and that change, that evolution in sexual orientation, the ability to discuss that, has happened a lot because it starts in school. It's okay to have a gay friend in school now. It's okay to have two moms. This kid has two moms, this kid has two dads. It's okay now. So that's one very important point, to start early, that it's okay to talk about this stuff. The second is to get away from the sensationalized movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, of mental illness, and the sensationalizing by the news media and the over coverage of some of these incidents that get us copycat people who see the glory, I'm using that very loosely, that the perpetrators of some of these things attain by having all the media coverage. So working with the media to try to more rationally explain and in film to less bizarrely portray psychiatric disorders.
Dr. Walsh, VP Anderson, Commissioner DeRienzo, I'd like to thank you for your time today and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our guests today for joining us and providing their unique perspectives. If you like what you saw in today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have any thoughts for me, feel free to email me or contact me by Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. And remember, every life is a book. Make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.